Thanks very much, Hito and Gerald and Ernesto. I'm going to somehow try to moderate between the extreme complexity and depth and provocativeness of your three talks somehow. And I thought I would start by trying to address the issue of horizon, which is the subject of today's conference. And we have three, from what I saw, we have three different models of horizons. Gerald was presenting a horizon that reached back to aesthetic philosophy and positioned the horizon as a sphere, a heterocosmos, according to Baumgarten's aesthetics. Hito's model of the horizon, as far as I could tell, was an attempt to contest the exclusivity of the horizontal notion of a horizon versus the vertical one, and instead proposing a complex horizon, I think, that was in a way more akin to a matrix, something that was constructed and imagined and fictitious in some ways. Both of those, by the way, are very spatial models of horizons, whereas Ernesto's, I thought, he was turning to a strongly linguistic model, a semiological model of a horizon as a field of discourse. So I'm curious, can we open up the conversation now by addressing specifically how each of these models, now that you've had a chance to prepare your papers for today and think about the issue of horizon, could you each summarize how you think the notion of horizon in your own framework is relevant and useful for thinking about art and politics today? So maybe Ernesto, you could begin.
Well, about the artistic matter, I cannot say anything, because really not my field.
Political horizon.
Political horizon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Specifically today.
Well, today I think we have a complex international situation in which it's very difficult to speak about general trends. At the time of the Cold War, there was a natural internationalization of the terms and the forms of confrontation. Today you have a much more nuanced and contextualized situation. For instance, in Western Europe today you have a populism, but this populism is a populism of the right, simply because the institutionalist consensus which was reached between right-wing parties and social democrats was such that all kinds of protest movement against this tend to be expressed through the right. And sometimes people who want to protest against the status quo join the right. For instance, in France is the phenomenon which is called the gaucho-le penisme. Many of the former voters of the French Communist Party today are voting Le Pen because he's the one who represents a confrontational politics. In Latin America, you have, on the contrary, a populism which is associated with the left. There is practically no populism of the right in Latin America. And the reason, I think, is also the fact that in Latin America, what you have are institutional liberal oligarchies which represent the status quo, so the moment of protest and popular mobilization comes from the left. Populism is a term that is increasingly less pejorative in Latin America because everybody associates with progressive movements such as the movement of Evo Morales, or the movement of Chavez, or the movement of the Kirchner, etc. So the horizons are obviously different. I think on the whole, I have more hope of what is going to come in terms of left-wing horizons from Latin America today than from Europe.
I agree with that, totally. But what comes to my mind when you're speaking about this more state-related and party-related things, that there are at least different levels of talking about this question of the political horizon. And I think there is not so much an opposition between aesthetic and political horizon. Maybe it's more a question about, on one hand, concerning size, macro and micro political answers towards the question of the horizon, and also concerning the structure, maybe between molar and molecular forms. So what I want to see as complementary to your just stated position would be the term again from Guattari called molecular revolution, and that's very connected to this aesthetics of existence aspects, meaning experimenting and trying out new forms of life, not only in this very big sense of biopolitics, but also on the small levels of micropolitics. And concerning again, this is complementary, and maybe at least as much important as the political changes in elections and state related transformations is of course the social movements, and I think maybe in Latin America you have a certain connection between social movements and states, but in Europe I would see that quite far from each other. And of course, maybe also we should be not too affirmative concerning the Latin American movements, but also stay with a certain self-critical and critical point of view towards the processes concerning the states in, let's say, Venezuela or Brazil in this on this range. Not only affirm the developments there, but also criticize the sometimes problematic points of rupture between the state left and the social movements. Really, going back to Venezuela, it seems that after a certain period of going together of both the molecular and the molar, there seems to be tension rising.
And just to ask you a question about this, you've written much about the aesthetics and politics of the micro-political, and I'm wondering how do you address the potential evacuation of investment in governmental politics? Is in supporting the micro-political of artistic practices, is there not in some ways a depoliticization on the level of the state?
I can't answer really to this question, but I just want to repeat that for me there is no clear difference between the function of aesthetical and political practices. I mean, it's not on this level. It's maybe a matter of professions, of specific competencies of certain people groups and so on, but there is no structural difference if we are talking about horizons.
Hito, I'm curious, you could address that question, or yeah.
No, I mean, I can't address anything of what you said, because actually I'm still trying to get around my head to the notion of the political horizon today anyway. I don't think it exists, frankly. I mean, my whole point in my presentation has been to stress that I think that there are visual paradigms at that moment that exclude any sort of horizon, if you wish, because, I mean, if you look at things from above, there is no horizon, frankly. I mean, there is something, you know, within a field of vision, but this doesn't establish anymore any sort of constitutive difference, no more antagonism, you know, nothing is being opened up. The horizon is nowhere and it's anywhere at the same time because, you know, as the point of view drifts over the surface, it could include any of the previously excluded points at any point in time. So at this moment, I really don't see how to speak meaningfully about, you know, a political horizon, because as I said, whenever we try to look at something on the horizon, all we see is a ground, basically. And the ground, and in the strong sense, I think, really has replaced this notion of, you know, a horizon of expectation, this slightly religious idea that there's something beyond what we can see, which could come as us and somehow redeem us. I don't think that this is an option today anymore, starting from the very visual, I mean, really materialistically visual sort of paradigm I have been describing. And I think that this point that I tried to make, that grounds are all we see when we are trying to look for horizons nowadays, is very well exemplified in this instance you have been mentioning about the right-wing populisms, you know. This is what we see at the horizon, and it's a very strong ground. It's not a weak ground at all. It's a ground that speaks about origin, you know, about belonging, about descendants, about racism, about xenophobia, about all these things. And I think that we really have to find different ways of dealing, first of all, with this visual paradigm, and we cannot relapse anymore into this sort of political messianism, if you like, which is constituted horizontally.
Yes, I want to refer to the issue that Gerald has raised. In the first place, I'm not at all against micro-politics in the sense that many people have defended, but I think it's a level that the classical party forms have systematically ignored, and the autonomy of this spontaneous formation, I think, is also important. But I think that politics, it remains only at that level, is incapable of producing changes. I give you one example. The mobilization of '68 in France. Big mobilization, big general strike, and however, nothing happened. Why? Because nobody of the participants of the mobilization of '68 was thinking politically. There was only one person who thought politically in that circumstances, who was Pierre Mendès France. He was in Chile in a lecturing tour when the events of '68 happened. He returned immediately to France, spoke on the television and said that he was prepared to form a government if he had unanimous support of the left. So the reversal of the accession of de Gaulle in '58, 10 years earlier. Now, this didn't work for various reasons. Firstly, because the Communist Party, with his cautious corporative politics, the last thing they wanted is to see the emergence in France of a left-wing populism. And secondly, because the gauchists work with the idea of the imagination to power, which was simply the idea of a power which would be purely imaginary. And the result of this was that a few months later, de Gaulle won massively the elections. And it's not because of the people who were particularly sympathetic at that stage to de Gaulle. The proof is that 1 year later he lost the referendum and he had to leave power. It was because when people feel that they are threatened by disorder, any kind of order is preferable to a jump in the void, which would lead to chaos. Now, to think politically, I think is very important. I give you another example. In Argentina, there was the crisis of 2001. And at that moment, the explosion of new forms of social protest. There was the piqueteros, there was the retrieve factories and all that. Now, this was again not a political movement because people said all of them have to go, que se vayan todos. And this was always a dangerous formula because if all go leave, somebody will remain always, and if he has not been elected by anybody, is not going to be the best one. So there was low participation in the elections, and the things went well because the one who was elected was Kirchner. And Kirchner tried to encourage the autonomous mobilization of people, that the horizontal level of micropolitics was complemented with a vertical level through which these people could influence policies in the public sphere. So I think always politics has to operate at the two levels. In 2002, in Venezuela, there was the military coup, which was largely stopped by a popular mobilization. But this popular mobilization, if Chavez had not been there at the top of power, probably would have disgregated very quickly. I disagree, by the way, with your account of the relationship between the Chavez regime and the social movement. But anyway, it's a long subject. I don't want to.
I'd like to hear Gerald address what Hito was saying before, but first, Hito, could you? I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on this. If the biggest threat today, what we have to take most seriously is right-wing populism, but we can't do so by recourse to a political horizon in the way that you're saying. Where can opposition come from? And could you relate that to artistic practice today, specifically?
No, I can't.
Do you want to respond?
No, I have one more question. It's more about elaborating what you said, not transferring it to the art field, but elaborating. Also, maybe concerning this visual aspects of the ground, which I could understand very well from your lecture, and connected maybe with the structure or the form of these right-wing movements, because you were in a way kind of paralleling it, the ground, and so maybe right-wing social movements being grounded or having a perspective towards ground, no?
They have a specific relation to Boden, you know, to the ground, or where people are born, to the earth, to the soil, to all these sort of things. So in that sense, they draw very heavily, you know, on this metaphor of the ground. I mean, that much is obvious, no? But well. No, the thing is really what I'm trying to get my head around, this whole visual setup, the system of people who are looking at something which is a constellation which works in a specific way, you know. Is it useful for trying to come up with new solutions in a situation which I think is new as well? Does this paradigm, you know, somebody is standing on a weak or strong ground, in that sense it doesn't really matter, and looks out at something on the horizon which is basically very, you know, resonant with what I said about central perspective paradigm. Of course, this will constitute the subject of, you know, what is being, the horizon or what is being seen will retroactively constitute the subject of, you know, the view. But is this useful nowadays? Have not the parameters and the conditions of visuality shifted to a point where we should try to maybe expand or even compress or, I don't know, rip this scheme, which is very much connected with the visual conditions of modernity. And thus this whole metaphorical setup, and I suppose that maybe both of you were using the horizon much more in a metaphorical way as I did, trying to understand it as a sort of material configuration of forces and points of views. Is this scheme, is it really helpful today in trying to come up with new perspectives? And maybe this perspective and point of view, issue is something which I can relate to more than the issue of horizon, which implies a sort of very linear relationship to me, which is also connected with certain ideas of spatiality, of time, of future. I mean, Walter Benjamin, he was actually drawing on Erwin Panofsky, whom I quoted today. Erwin Panofsky wrote about empty homogeneous space in relation to central perspective, and Walter Benjamin transformed that into, his famous slogan of the empty homogeneous time. And all of these things are sort of implied within this visual paradigm. So are we really do we really want to carry on that luggage of modernity, including these temporal and spatial connotations that go along with it? And you know that Walter Benjamin, in his last text on history, was very much, he said, this notion of temporality, a future coming at us, from the horizon, automatically is going to carry us, into progress and so on and so on. He said that was responsible for the demise of the left, for its historical loss against fascism. So what I'm trying to say is, do we want to carry on, carry along, the same type of notions of temporality and spatiality into an essentially new situation? Is this helpful?
I don't think anyone here is proposing that, though. I mean, I think that's certainly a risk, but I think maybe this is one way in which we could talk about the formerness of the horizon, in the terms, like you were attempting to historicize the horizon in an important way, and I think both Gerald, who's talking about what he calls institutive, constituent practices, is a new way of inventing the horizon as a potential site of political activity, and similarly Ernesto was attempting to do so in terms of his notion of a constitutive horizon. I think both are attempts to develop new kinds of horizons that would be useful and politically pragmatic today. Yeah,
I mean, I was absolutely not trying to imply that anybody, had actually, I think all three, notions of horizons which were developed today are essentially quite different, and one would really need to spend a lot of time trying to translate them into each other. We should not assume that we are talking about the same thing. What I'm trying to say is that if I talk about horizon, then there is this whole, historical baggage and ballast. Maybe ballast is the wrong word, but luggage connected to it. And I'm asking myself, because, I mean, as you said, words define, retroactively, or notions or concept define the radius, the possibility of possible actions. So, how about the horizon? What sort of possibility of action does it open up? And do we, why not think about something else,
Another aspect that I'd like to point out, that I think all presentations related to, was Hito. You brought up in historicizing perspective, in one point perspective, that it assumes a one-eyed person. There's an agent. There's an individual, and so this notion of horizon, the former horizon of Enlightenment modernity, assumes a subject. And I think all three of the talks were very insistent on trying to develop a new kind of political formation beyond the subjective, or beyond the individualistic. So could you comment on that? Gerald, do you want to say something about that?
I can start. I think I just repeat a bit with other words what I was saying in the discussion of my lecture, because it came to my mind that I'm a bit short in my answers because it's a mode of subjectivation to read this paper and be in the paper and think everything is clear, but nothing is clear. So I just start by repeating something. It's about this tricky figure of the paresiastes, the guy or the I don't want to gender it, the person who speaks the truth and there is danger involved. And I think because the examples of Foucault are very well connected to the classical antiquity, mostly Greek but also Latin ethics. I think that's why one tends to stick to this embodied truth speaker or the embodiment of truth speaking. And the crucial thing is that if you read Foucault in depth, then you see that he's always speaking about the relation between the one who starts the truth speaking and a certain sphere, I would say. That's again the aesthetic horizon from Baumgarten here, where it's all about relations and not about embodying truth. And maybe it's also interesting to see the other side of it. It's also not about essentializing collectives, neither the big collectives of the party or whatever, nor the smaller groups like I did with the artist group Steyerlas. I didn't want to kind of hypostasize the collective work, but it's really a thwarting of this idea of the individual or the collective. That's just to repeat and maybe begin another round.
Do you want to comment on that? Is the horizon necessarily a social horizon?
The social horizon, yes. I think without horizon there is no structuration of meaning. It's as simple as that. Not only social horizon, but horizon in general is the terrain in which meaning and identities are created. But social horizons, what I want to insist, is are created at various levels. And to create the articulation between these different levels is one of the most important political tasks. To give you an example, Italy after the Second World War, there the party level, the level of the Communist Party was practically the only form of structuring social protest. Because the country came from fascism, where there had been a degradation of all form of resistance, and during the period of the War of Liberation, the presence of the Communist Party was decisive in all movements of radical democratization. And in fact, for the first 20 years, that party level was enormously important in organizing many grassroots struggles for the problem of, in the South, for instance, for the problem of water, for the against the mafia, the school cooperatives, and so on. There was a whole network of institutions which were being created, but the party had clear hegemony. And the hegemony of the party is only created, it's only enters into crisis only at the end of the 1960s for a set of reasons. Firstly, the new type of strikes, wild strike, which passed over the trade union leadership, which trade union leadership was the backbone of the Communist Party policy. Secondly, the student mobilizations, style 68, which were almost incomprehensible for the traditional communist militant. And finally, the eruption of feminism, which in Italy was really a mass phenomenon, was not a phenomenon of universities only like in America. And so the point is that the language of the feminist movement in those years was totally unacceptable for the Communist Party. For instance, there was no way that the Communist Party would support a slogan like copulation without penetration. In those circumstances, the hegemony of the party became too foundering, and finally the autonomous movements start emerging. And there you have, Gerald, many of the things that you are speaking about. What I think is that today the party form in the classical way is not the form of constituting a social horizon, but the purely grassroots type of politics which ignores the level of the state, I don't think is possible either. There has to be, using a formula of Gadamer, but in a different sense than Gadamer, some kind of fusion of horizon coming from different angles. And for instance, the alter globalization movement started creating a new language. When you went to the meetings in Porto Alegre, you found all kind of workshops, women in Zimbabwe and gays in California, and institutional mobilization in Holland, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there was an attempt to create a common language to all these things. So some kind of a new horizon was in the process of being produced. But for instance, speaking from the Latin American experience, the passage through the state, I think, is absolutely vital, because the local oligarchies are constituted against the centrality of the state apparatus.
Okay, Hito, do you want to address that before we open it up to the audience? No. Are there questions from the floor? There's one over here.
Thanks. I wanted to say that I think Hito's contribution is the most fundamentally important for one very good reason. You began very beautifully with the Renaissance and the construction of things illustrated both by the quadrant and Renaissance painting. But in fact, the evolution of perspective evolved from ballistic needs. It was ballistics and the desire to, get your crossbows further and further that actually made the inventions that led to its appropriation, if you like, for its own usage by the art world. And what you didn't say was, of course, all those developments are linked to concepts of obsolescence, so that the medieval flat world picture became completely useless and obsolete. And what you are positing in your ground perspective, with its complete collapse not only of East and West, but of senses of geography, with these one-eyed, myopic Americans firing in Afghanistan in their screens and then going home and telling their bedtime stories and having psychic troubles in Las Vegas. What you are positing is a very, very serious forthcoming obsolescence of our regimes of representation, including this business of horizon. And I've been very impressed by people very tactfully and beautifully referring to Istanbul in some of their interventions, the history of Istanbul and so on and so forth. And it would seem to me pretty obvious, and I'm thinking of my own faraway trip to Pierre Loti's house here, that when Istanbul was chosen as an appropriate and a very, very appropriate and politically appropriate place to have this conference, I presume that the title then came out of people's fantasy of having the Congress in Istanbul. Obviously, I don't know the machinations of this, but On Horizons, Art and Political Imagination is a very beautiful title for a conference in Istanbul. And I think that possibly this kind of preceded the difficulties that have been brought up by this very, very disturbing and important suggestion of obsolescence. And just to say at the end, I just think it's worth pointing out that right-wing populism begins as an expression of impotence and blindness before it's manipulated into expressions of evil.
There's a question over here by Peter.
Yeah, this actually relates to what Sarah just said in relation to ballistics, because the visual technologies, the new visual technologies that you're showing, have mainly been connected to military technologies. Yeah, so it raises the question, in a way, of power and what the position in the visual field, if you like, of the bombed is. You know, I mean, it's wholly, all of these are the subject position of the faller in free fall, or the bomber. But what about the people on the ground? In other words, we don't really get, and it's interesting that there's very little generation of images of the sky, which would be the equivalent, right? So it's not so much a question about your the way you framed it, but the way this visual field is constructed doesn't, in some sense, seem to allow any visual projection from the standpoint of the powerless within it. They don't have any position at all. Is that right?
Okay, I will just tell you an anecdote also to stress the fact that I think even, you know, the opposition between above and below is not, you know, monolithic anymore. Because actually what happens with these drone live feeds is that they were hijacked and are still being hijacked by insurgents using a software which costs $29.95. And they are intercepting those feeds, and they know whether they are being targeted or not. So this maybe illustrates the real complication of all these dimensionalities we're talking about and how interdependent they are, because even the perspective on the ground, I mean the perspective of the bombed, you know, is not essentially, I mean can under certain circumstances, is not essentially different, you know, from the bombers. They sort of hijack that same, they use the same sort of technology to evade the bombing. I find that really interesting. But on the other hand, I really think also that, you know, in this suggestion of a fragmented 3D ground, which consists of fragile shelters and, you know, tunnels below, which belong to different sort of sovereignties and jurisdictions, that needs to be explored as well. And that is not a stable perspective either, but a perspective which sort of fragments in a 3D perspective.
I'd like to echo what Sarah and Peter have mentioned already about the horizons, but also go back to TJ's initial question in the introduction, or comment in the introduction, that perhaps it has become a privilege to reclaim the horizon. It's the privilege of the academic as well as artistic discourses, but also if we consider the politics and economy of the horizon, and I have in mind the growing urban centers and metropolises such as Cairo. It has become a privilege, literally, to have access to a horizon when in the conditions when most of the population in this 20 million city is confined within the core of the city, the downtown. It's like a cyberpunk fantasy realized, whereas the upper classes are leaving the city for these suburban villas where there is a horizon. And I'm wondering whether whether the question is not whether we should abandon the horizon or not, but perhaps we should democratize it. Because what you are talking about, the other dimensions, the fragmentation of vision that this entails, is also a certain abstraction of vision. There is no phenomenology in that space where the pilot operates through remote control, but there is phenomenology in a horizontal perspective or in a horizontal space, which creates a different form of relationality. And I'm wondering whether we should actually reclaim the horizon and democratize it precisely because it is not accommodated within the existing dominant techniques and paradigms of vision. It's maybe a rhetorical question, or if you'd like to comment.
She was asking whether we should democratize if that shouldn't be the goal of politics today, that we should need to democratize the horizon.
Yes, a horizon can be democratic, or can be authoritarian, or can be fascist, or can be communist. That is to say, there is no guarantee that the horizon is going to be necessarily good. A democratic horizon, I think, is possible to be created, but it's going to be created in a different way in different societies. For instance, let's suppose that you have, at some point, in a certain locality, a group of neighbors would present to the town hall the demand of the creation of a line of buses taking them from the places where they live to the places in which most of them work. If this demand is accepted, it's the end of the matter. But if this demand is not accepted, there is a frustration of a social demand. And if people start seeing that there are other demands concerning housing, concerning health, concerning schooling, and so on, which are not met, some kind of solidarity between all these demands start existing, and a frontier separating the local power from the people start being created. That is a typical pre-populist situation. At some point, however, it's necessary that this whole equivalential chain crystallize around some kind of a name, formula, symbol, and so on, which signifies the totality of the chain. Now, this can be, in the example that I'm giving you, perfectly well the locus of emergence of a democratic horizon. That is to say, all these demands can be organized in a democratic way. But you can have other areas in which people say all these evils are the result of the presence of immigrants, and you are going to create chains of equivalence and horizons which are going to go in a completely different direction. And at the same time, there can be a movement from one type of horizon to the other. I don't know if that is the issue that you were raising, but that is the way I would address it.
Hito, do you want to respond? No? I think we have time for two last questions from over here. So, Shuda?
I just want to introduce another set of spatial metaphors into the discussion, which is surface and depth. And I think that it's actually quite interesting to think about the actions of the state often as actions from within depths. It's a concept that we in India have learned a lot from the experience of Turkey, where the deep state is a reality that is increasingly apparent in our situation, where incidentally extrajudicial killings in India are always called encounters, to come back to your, the other Indians and what happened to them. But what I think is interesting in this question of surface and depth and the deep state also refers in some ways to your Professor Laclau's invocation of Augustine's dilemma about the presence of evil and God being either omnipotent or good, the state either acting or being lawful in this case. That often when it acts outside its own laws, so that there is perfect deniability. In operations that, let's say, the intelligence apparatus undertakes in India, you can never name the action because it is actually falls outside its own laws. So the state will always say, this didn't happen because if we had done it, we wouldn't have done it this way. But of course, and that creates increasingly a kind of a hole in our discussion of politics where everybody knows that certain things are happening, but nobody can name them because they're actually outside our coordinates of naming, and they occur at great depth. So I'd like you to respond to this phenomenon. All of you, actually, because I think it also ties to what Hito said, that, you know, this question of it's not just a horizon that you can see. There are things happening either far above or far below that require a different perception of how we think about action in terms of not just our distance, but our submergence or presence above them.
Thanks. Who would like to address that? Would you like to?
I think it was
Hito?
for her thing.
I agree. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a question maybe that also relates to this issue of democracy, and I'm wondering if for any of you it would be, well, maybe to start from if it would be productive, or can we say that there is a difference between our surroundings and our horizon? Is that a distinction that could be useful? Because in a way, one could say that the argument of free falling is that there is only horizon everywhere, but no surroundings. But could we say that there are surroundings and horizons? And the reason why I'm asking is that it seems to me that in most nation states, we can at least, if democracy is only a name, we can say nominally most of us are surrounded by democracy. So therefore, can democracy then also be the horizon? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on such a distinction.
Did you just ask that? Did you mean to say we are surrounded by democracies? I'm not so sure.
Can we say that
that
democracy is our surrounding, if democracy is only a name for political institutions that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, but maybe we could also try to think about the situation we find ourselves in as a situation which is in a process to transition towards several forms of post-democracy. You know, I mean, maybe that might be. I mean, I'm just startled, you know, by your like automatic assumption that we live in democracies. Actually, I don't really think that we should call these states democracies anymore. I mean, there have been so many examples, you know, it has been called financial despotism, you know, multipolar oligarchism, all these sorts of things. I think that's interesting surroundings, and that will also restructure, you know, the points of views from which we start seeing things which are not anymore bipolar, but, you know, from very different perspectives. I mean, that's my initial response to that.
Yeah, no, well, I would add, I don't know if it's exactly related to the intervention of Simon, but indirectly, yes, I think, which is the fact that there is no reason to believe that democratization necessarily is something which is done against the state, because many times the state is an important instrument in creating class consciousness or popular consciousness in the masses, and to launch them to the historical arena. For instance, in Venezuela you had, we were talking about that before, you had, before Chavismo, a totally clientelistic, dominated rural structure, in which simply there were areas in which the closest medical doctor was at 2 days of distance. So people died like flies. After Chavismo, now there are, in the interior of Venezuela, 35,000 Cuban technicians, mainly doctors and teachers, who have gone to live exactly in this area, with risk for their life because they are very insecure areas and they have killed some of them. But the degree of mobilization which is taking place in the whole interior of Venezuela over the last 10 years has no precedent in the history of the country. So many times the state is really an instrument of mobilizing and creating popular consciousness.
And even more, maybe the educational programs in Venezuela are kind of revolutionary. But still, I really, maybe there is no time to discuss this thoroughly, but there is the problem, and that's not a problem of Chavez, the problem of this relationship between state and social movements that tends to become more difficult and difficult. As I understood, in Venezuela, the kind of basic democratic movements are, of course, getting tired after, I don't know, so many years of revolution, in solidarity with the state. But still, as I understood, there is a problem in this getting tired of social movements when at the same time the state is as strong as it was before. So it's not only a story of successful revolution.
The state was, in the first place, you have different types of societies in Latin America. Argentina is a society with a civil society relatively structured. So the government can count on local power more than in Venezuela. In Venezuela it was a sort of gelatinous, to use the Gramscian term, society in which even the most elementary social activities require some type of state intervention. But people are not in Venezuela, I have been often there, discouraged by the excess of state intervention, but are discouraged in case they are by the deficiency in the state intervention. Because that is another thing, in all these regimes, it's necessary to distinguish different branches of power. For instance, the parliament in Latin America, as a rule, is far more to the right than the executive power, because the parliament is dominated by local oligarchies, and these local oligarchies control the votes in a clientelistic way. So they try to stop the development of advanced social legislation by the executive, for instance. And there, the thing is different in different countries. Perón was a leader who had a homogeneous social base, because the triangle of the three industrial cities, Rosario, Córdoba, and Buenos Aires, had the bulk of the population. And so he was able to address a mass which was homogeneous. Vargas in Brazil had an extremely regionalized country, and so he had to make transactions with a local power which, as a rule, was far less advanced than the executive led by Vargas. So the situation, I think, Gerald, has to be considered yes.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it there. Thank you very much to Hito Steyerl, Gerald Raunig, and Ernesto Laclau. We're going to break now for lunch. Afterwards, we'll come back at what time? 4 o'clock? At 4 o'clock, and for the talk between Dmitry Volensky and Robert Semper. So please join us, and we'll see you then.